to the cloud. Okay. So hopefully you had an opportunity. Last night. You got an email from me. I recorded a review session for the 4th exam. Now there are some things on the exam on Wednesday that I haven't talked about yet, but good news, we're talking about that today. And on Friday, we are going to review for the exam. So if you are not planning on taking the final, and I know that there's some of you that you've done well enough on the exams and the projects and stuff to not take the final, you don't have to be here on Friday. Yay! So we're just going to review for the final on Friday, and we'll go over the study guide. Yeah, Meraki.
Are you going to post the results from our final exam on Wednesday before Friday?
Okay, so here's what I'm going to do, and I'll give you a heads up on this. So for those of you that are kind of on the fence in terms of your grade, so you're thinking about taking the final, but you're not sure, like those of you that need the final, you know who you are. You missed an exam or you didn't do very well on an exam, like you know who you are. And so I am telling you, please don't ask for your test to be graded first because you already know you're going to be there, and take it online on Monday. But for those of you that are kind of on the fence, you're potentially thinking about trying to bump up a letter grade or bump up from a minus to just a regular grade or a regular grade to a plus. What I'd like you to do on Wednesday is put a star on the top right corner of your exam. I will grade the stars first. And for those of you who are definitely taking the final, or for those of you that are definitely not taking the final, don't put a star. It doesn't work if everybody has a star on their test. So be mindful about whether or not you think you're going to be here or not. But if you're on the fence, put a star. I will have those graded, possibly even on Wednesday afternoon. I don't have band practice anymore, so I get an extra hour in my day and I can whip through those exams like nothing. So those grades, you will have them up by Friday morning at the very latest. In fact, if I don't, I'm hoping to get them done by Thursday afternoon. They may even be up sooner, so keep checking. Now, really quick, for those of you who are interested in extra credit, I want to go ahead and check in on our percentages to see how we're doing. Okay, let me go ahead and check in. Right now, I've got 46%. That is a little less than 50% of the class, and that is well below the 80% that we need for everybody to get 5 extra credit points. So if you haven't done it yet, or you know your classmates haven't done it yet, please politely nudge them. Don't threaten. Occasionally, when I've done this in the past, I have students turn to other students and go, hold a fist up like, you better do it. I'm like, don't threaten. Violence is not cool. But politely nudge your classmates, make sure to get it done, because if we don't hit that 80%, nobody gets it, you know. And by the way, I don't necessarily care about what you say. You can have constructive feedback for me, or you can tell me what you really liked about the class. I just want you to get them done. Okay? All right. So we are going to go ahead and continue. Don't forget that I believe you have a quiz that is due this afternoon. So make sure you've completed it. Don't forget that we also have practice quizzes for chapters 12 for personality and chapter 13 for psychological disorders. And tomorrow I will go ahead and put up practice quizzes for chapters 1, 2, and 3 so that you can practice for the final, those of you who are thinking about taking it. Additionally, for those of you who want to learn about social psychology, I will send you some links to lectures that I recorded last year. They're not going to be on the final. It's just if you want to learn more. I have them already. They're already recorded, and I'm happy to share those with you if you want them. All right. So remember, the final exam is Monday. It's online through e-learning. It posts at midnight. You will have until noon to take it. It's 2 hours. It is 2 hours, and you only get to take it once. I did not put on lockdown browser, so I can't really control what you do while you're online, but I would strongly encourage you to actually try to study for this. I will record a review session for you this week to help you prepare, but it's going to be easier for you if you actually try to study for this, because if you don't study and you're trying to browse and search for answers on that exam, you're not going to do very well and you're not going to finish in the time allotted. Those 2 hours can go by really quickly. So do kind of keep that in mind. They need to be in by noon, no exceptions. And remember, for Wednesday, if you know that you're not going to be here on Wednesday, you need to let me know. So sometimes it's happened this semester where people just haven't shown up for the exam and they ask for makeup either because they were sick or for other reasons. Here's the thing. I wish I could do that this time, but I can't. I've got 5 days between our 4th exam and the final, and I have to get grades in quickly. So I don't really have time to grant makeups or exceptions this time. I've been pretty lenient with those, but this is the one time that I can't be, and I do apologize for that, but I'm on a tight schedule. If I don't get those grades in, academic records comes after me, and I don't want that. All right. How's everybody doing though? Did you have a good time at Hanging of the Greens? Yeah, the food was good. I like those stuffed mushrooms. They're not vegan, but I don't care. They were delicious. All right. So the last time we were here, we were talking about our mood disorders. So bipolar disorder, as we were talking about last time, alternates between periods of depression, which largely match what we talked about when we discussed clinical depression. You have those feelings of worthlessness, sleep issues. You are either sleeping too much or you're sleeping too little. You are either eating too much or you're eating too little. Additionally, you have feelings of worthlessness. You're losing enjoyment of the things that you previously used to enjoy. So in general, you're withdrawing from activities that used to make you happy. And potentially, in very severe cases, you are potentially experiencing suicidal ideation. So bipolar disorder has those moments, but then it alternates between those depressive episodes and those periods of mania. And again, I just want to remind you that mania does not mean like being like Dr. Gilchrist, bouncy, happy, happy. We are talking about overexcitation and impulsivity. And what I would encourage you to do if you're curious and you want to learn more about these manic episodes, take a look at PET scans or PET scans of the brain during a manic episode versus a depressive episode. And one of the things that we're going to see is during those manic episodes, the brain, I dislike using this phrase because when we talk about PET scans or fMRI scans, areas of the brain don't actually light up. They're just more active than other parts of the brain. So I dislike using the phrase light up, but this is general psychology, so I'll go ahead and use it here. Parts of the brain are lighting up more than normal. And during a depressive episode, those same areas are often underactive. So you have this widespread excitatory activity in the brain. So we get this impulsivity. We have a lot of energy. A lot of these people can go for several days without sleep. They have an elevated mood to the point of euphoria. They have a lot of extra energy. They talk fast. If you can believe it, they might even talk faster than me. And additionally, there is some edginess, there is some irritability, and in very severe cases of mania, they can actually display delusions. So ideas like delusions of grandeur, they're the most important person in the world, they own the United States, for example, these delusions that are not true. And they can potentially have some psychotic features very similar to very severe forms of schizophrenia. So here's what's interesting about bipolar disorder, and I mentioned this last time. Many of the disorders that we have talked about, including anxiety disorders, including depression, tend to occur more often in women than in men. Now, as I kind of talked about, some of this, certainly not all, is due to socialization. By and large, if you identify as female in our culture, you are often socialized to focus on feelings, to be open about your feelings, and to recognize your own emotions and also the emotions in other people. If you identify as male in our culture, this is something that is not necessarily pushed upon you. And so because of that, people who identify as female are often more likely to seek help when things go wrong than generally men do. Now, what's interesting though, is that with bipolar disorder, it is equally common in men and in women. And what this tends to suggest, and you're just gonna have to take my word for this, but when you see this kind of lack of gender difference, it's usually because there is a very strong genetic link. So this is something that typically will run in families. And as we're about to find out, schizophrenia is very, very similar. Now, one of the things that I will mention is that the age of onset for men and women is a little bit different. So we know for men, bipolar tends to manifest in late adolescence and early adulthood, and that can be true for women as well. But there's also an additional bump around one's 40s or 50s for women where bipolar might be more likely to be diagnosed. And researchers have suggested that part of the reason this happens is because you get a lot of hormonal shifts in early adulthood and late adolescence, and then in your 40s and 50s for women, because that's typically when menopause happens and you get that drop off in estrogen. And so there are some slight differences in age of onset. And then additionally, as we talked about, there are technically two types of bipolar disorder. There is bipolar type 1, which is typically more severe. The manic episodes are bigger. Bipolar type 2, oftentimes we're going to find that the depressive episodes are about the same as you would find in bipolar type 1, but the manic episodes are not as severe. So sometimes people with bipolar type 2 actually get kind of frustrated because they have bipolar, they have these massive depressive episodes that are pretty intense, but they don't get the same like intensity for the manic episodes. And so sometimes people with type 2 have occasionally reported feeling a little cheated because those manic episodes, when you've got all of this energy and you've got these racing thoughts and ideas and this enhanced productivity, those can be really fun for people with bipolar disorder. And really, a lot of people with bipolar enjoy the productivity and how they feel during their manic episodes. And because of that, it can be really difficult to keep them on medication. And generally too, the kind of medication that we give for people with bipolar disorder, it can be in certain cases, like if it's lithium, can actually be really dangerous and generally leads to some pretty unpleasant feelings. But getting them to take that medication is difficult because oftentimes the medication reduces the mania. Any questions so far? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about mood disorder. So one of the things that will come up on your exam is the fact that, like everything else, mood disorders are biopsychosocial phenomena. Now, oftentimes when we talk about something like depression or bipolar, we spend a lot of time talking about the chemical imbalances, or we talk about the genetic links, but that's just the biology. Depression and other mood disorders are much, much more than that. One of the things that we will find is that stress is typically going to be a massive trigger. And here's the thing, remember what we talked about in chapter 10. Not everything that is stressful is necessarily a negative thing. We can have good types of stress. For many of you, going to college is a wonderful fun time, but with it comes a lot of stress and adjustment. Christmas, one of my favorite times of the year, can be incredibly stressful for some people. So good things can be stressful, and what we find is that depression is typically going to be triggered by stressful events. Now, that doesn't mean always, but it does mean that the environment that you are in can potentially be a contributor to developing depression and things like that. So oftentimes what we're going to find is that big triggers will often be the loss of a loved one or a friend or a pet. It can be the loss of a job. It can be something like moving. It can be something like starting college, dealing with natural disasters or things like that. And so all of those things can potentially trigger depression to result. Now, depression really changes the way that you see the world. So how many of you are familiar with the phrase rose-colored glasses? Okay, what does it mean to have rose-colored glasses? Yeah, Michelle.
It's like everything you look at, you see it in a positive light.
Okay, so maybe even to the point of naivete.
Yeah.
So basically looking at the bright side on everything, kind of ignoring any red flags that you might see. So depression, in terms of what it does to our thoughts and our behavior, typically does the opposite for us. It basically creates a situation where we're looking at the world through dark colored glasses. So we tend to interpret things in the most negative light possible. And what this ends up doing when we have these negative thoughts, your thoughts affect your behavior. And what this will often do is, especially if we're talking about depression, where we are dealing with issues related to low self-worth, is that we're going to start withdrawing from people. We're going to start withdrawing from the things that are helpful to us. We're going to withdraw from the things that bring us joy. And that's only going to end up making us feel worse and creating more situations of stress for us, thus enhancing the cycle of depression. And we do find, unlike a lot of disorders that we talked about, so I mentioned, for example, that dissociative identity disorder seems to be more prevalent in the United States than in other countries. Here's another example. Schizophrenia is actually more common in countries in the Western Hemisphere than in the Eastern Hemisphere. But depression is a global phenomenon. It is not specific to a certain culture. It is not specific to a certain country or a certain hemisphere. It is a common experience for many, many people. And that's why we need to take it seriously. Yeah.
Why is schizophrenia only much more seen in the Western culture?
We're not entirely sure. One of the theories that I have heard is that, and again, I want to be careful because I'm worried that I might be stereotyping when I say these things. I believe that certain cultures in the Eastern Hemisphere might look at things like hearing voices. They tend to focus more on the spiritual enlightenment aspects, but other than that, we don't really know. Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that we are going to find, and so I want to spend some time on this because it is a short answer question, and it is also a multiple choice question on your test. This is what is sometimes referred to as the social cognitive perspective of depression. Depression often worsens itself due to social situations that we create as a self-fulfilling prophecy, and also the thoughts that we think. Now, I want to be really clear when I say this. If you are struggling with depression, this is not me saying that it's your fault because you are thinking bad thoughts. I am not saying that. What I am saying is that research has found that for many people who struggle with depression, there are some commonalities that we see in the way that people think. and it could potentially make the situation worse. If you find yourself in one of these situations and you notice that your thoughts look very similar to the kind of thoughts that I am showing and sharing with you today, I would highly recommend counseling is a wonderful thing. And especially if your thoughts are affecting you, cognitive behavioral therapy is it's not a perfect system, but it's one great way to actually manage and reframe your thoughts in such a way that they help you feel less bad. Because generally with depression, one of the big things we want you to do is we want you to hate yourself a lot less. We want you to hate yourself a lot less because you don't deserve to hate yourself. Okay. So people with depression in general view things very negatively. And something else that a lot of people that struggle with depression tend to do, and folks, even people without depression struggle with this. I am certainly one of those people. How many of you have a tendency to dwell on things? Like something happens and you dwell on it. So it turns out we have a special term for this. It is called rumination. Now, how many of you have heard rumination in a different context? You might have heard about it with respect to cows. Rumination is when cows take a bunch of grass and they chew it over and over and over. So it turns out we kind of do the same thing. We chew on thoughts or situations over and over and over, like a cow chews on cud. It said cod. The transcription's not perfect. It makes me laugh. But how many of you have noticed that when you dwell on these things, you generally don't come out of the situation feeling much better? Sometimes when you're caught in that cycle, you've got to try to snap yourself out of it. And one of the other things that we find, according to the social cognitive perspective, is that for people who are struggling with depression, there are psychological factors, like the way that they think, that affects how they perceive events. In particular, when bad things happen, people who are predisposed to depression or people who are developing depression tend to think about the world in three major ways, or events in three major ways. They have an internal focus, they have a stable focus, and they have a global focus. So the opposite of internal, stable, and global are these. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time here. Okay, so I'm going to compare these three different things. So somebody who is depressed, when something bad happens to them, they tend to assume an internal focus. If something bad happens, it's their fault. It's my fault. I'm the one to blame for this. It's because of me. In contrast, I'm not saying everybody does this. I have been described as a person who tends to assume way too much responsibility for things. Like when some of y'all don't do well in class, I have a tendency to blame myself. I'm like, why didn't they do better? It's my fault. I didn't teach them well enough. So you don't have to be depressed to necessarily have these ways of thinking, but it does make you more susceptible. These kind of ways of thinking do make you a little bit more susceptible to falling into that cycle. So it's something to be aware of. Now, somebody with an external focus is going to blame an outside source. So if I didn't do well on a test, it's because the questions were too hard. So it's an internal focus compared to an external focus. So somebody who's predisposed to depression or somebody who is depressed, they're going to have that internal focus. Additionally, they are going to treat what happens to them as stable rather than temporary or transient. So if they go ask somebody out and that person says no, they're going to go, well, I'm never going to get a date. I'm always going to be single. I'm always going to be alone. So that's kind of treating stable as it's always going to be this way. Or if they don't do well on a math test, I'm never going to be good at math. Versus this is just one section of math that I have a hard time with. So for example, maybe you don't do well on a math test and you had to do something like proofs in geometry. Yeah, I'm terrible at proofs. I was like, yeah, maybe I'm bad at proofs, but I'm good at other parts of math and I'll do better on the next test. That is a temporary focus compared to a stable focus where it's always going to be this way and it's never going to change. And then finally, we have a global focus rather than a local focus. So if I do badly on a math test, I will go, I'm bad at everything I try. I'm never going to be good at anything. Versus, yeah, maybe I'm bad at math, but I'm good at lots of other stuff. So instead of taking a local focus, maybe I'm just not good at this one thing. It becomes, I'm bad at everything. So it's that internal, it's my fault. It's stable. It's always going to be this way. And global, it affects everything. That's how people with depression tend to think, and people who are prone to depression tend to think. Can you see when you think that way, doesn't it just make you feel a little worse a little bit? It makes you kind of feel like, why bother, right? Like if it's me and it's always going to be me and I can never fix it, that's going to lower your mood. So if you struggle with this, even if you're not struggling with depression, I would encourage you as much as possible to focus on things, focus on an external focus. And let's be clear, sometimes bad things happen and it's your fault. But you also don't have to beat yourself up over it. You're human. You're going to make mistakes. So be gentle with yourself. Try to assume an external focus. Not everything hinges upon what you do. Have a temporary or a transient focus. Just because you've had one setback doesn't mean you're always going to have setbacks. For most of us, we tend to find that we have our hills when things are really good and we have our valleys. So know that it's not going to be bad all the time. And then finally, have a local focus. Just because you struggle with some things doesn't mean you struggle with everything. Try to find the parts of you that are good, the parts of you that you love, the things that you're good at. I'm sure you can find those. So you can kind of see how this type of thinking, the way that you view the world, can potentially affect your behavior. I know if I thought like this all the time, and I'm just speaking for me, I can't speak for any of you, but when I think this way, I'm generally not a great person to be around. I tend to be a little clingy and I call up my friends and go, do you hate me? Are you mad at me? Did I do something wrong? And good friends don't mind that, but they also don't constantly need to validate you all the time either. Eventually, if you keep asking, like, do you hate me? Or are you mad at me? Like, sometimes eventually they will be like, no, but everything you're doing, like this constant, are you mad at me? Are you mad at me? Are you mad at me is annoying me. And then you're going to be like, I knew it. You are mad at me. And it's just going to make things worse. So if you're struggling with these kind of thoughts, I would encourage you to talk to somebody. They can help you find ways to restructure your thoughts and refocus your thinking and not beat up on yourself so much. We could all stand to beat up on ourselves a lot less. Okay, oh, I gotta clear my drawings. Clear. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, so depression creates a cycle. Okay, so what we're going to find is that for people who struggle with depression, it creates a cycle. So stressful things happen. Your friends aren't around as much as they used to be. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. it's the end of the semester and finals are coming very close. So we have these stressful things, which you then view in your negative explanatory style, that internal, that stable, that global. And generally, most people who think this way aren't going to wind up feeling better about that stressful situation. Odds are pretty good when you focus on internal, stable, and global, you're going to end up feeling worse. That's going to create a depressed mood, which is going to create additional changes in your thoughts, in your behavior, which are going to potentially create more stressful things for you. And so the cycle continues. So we've got to find a way to break that cycle. So if I asked you about this on a short answer question, would you feel pretty good about being able to tackle this? Yeah? Okay.
Hint, hint,
Huh?
hint, hint.
Oh, not a hint. It's on the study guide. I talked about it last night. So it's not even a hint. It's like I'm putting up a big spotlight, like, learn it. It's not even a hint. It's blatant. How do you like that mellow yellow? It's not as good as Mountain Dew.
No. I used to drink it all the time, but I didn't have to.
When I lived in Atlanta, it's Coke country. It's impossible to find anything Pepsi. I even went to gas stations where they only had Coke products there. You would find that sometimes. So my only option at Georgia Tech was Mellow Yellow. It's not as good. It's just not. Okay, so now we're going to talk about schizophrenia. And I might show you a couple of videos today for this to kind of help explain some things. So in general, schizophrenia is very poorly misunderstood. And oftentimes people will conflate it with a dissociative identity disorder. I want to be really clear about something. Schizophrenia has nothing to do with multiple personalities. Nothing at all. Schizophrenia, now part of the reason that people get this confused is that schizophrenia comes from the Greek for split mind, but that's not due to personality. It's largely due to the fact that oftentimes people with schizophrenia will have very disorganized thoughts and very disorganized thinking. They will experience things like delusions and hallucinations. And so that's what we're referring to when we talk about a split mind. So here are some common symptoms of schizophrenia. So as I kind of mentioned, there is disordered thinking. So the thoughts will frequently shift from one thing to another. Sometimes one's thoughts will not make sense. In my biopsychology class, I actually show students videos of patients with schizophrenia. And sometimes I've seen one, for example, that talks about a TV tooth. So apparently he went to the dentist and the dentist put something in his tooth that can help him figure out TV signals, and they're watching him and things like that. So in addition, so we'll experience things like disorganized thoughts. We can also have delusions. So oftentimes these delusions are going to include things like delusions of grandeur, like we kind of talked about, like I own the entire planet. It is my planet. And I own all of the other planets too. I am the leader of these planets and I am the one who can save all of the planets. So we get this delusion of grandeur that we're this awesome, amazing person. We can have delusions of persecution. that other people are out trying to get us. We can have delusions of control. Other people are trying to control us. So maybe the weatherman is trying to control my mind through his talking on the TV and things like that. So these delusions create a sense of paranoia. And for a lot of people with schizophrenia, that's going to cause them to be very socially withdrawn. If you're worried that people out in the world are trying to persecute you or control you, you're probably not going to want to be around a lot of people. Yeah, Michelle.
What about someone who thinks that someone else is trying to like steal their energy?
What you mean, like energy vampires, people that actually drain your energy?
Like I know someone who has this, and they think that people are trying to steal their energy.
I'm not a clinician, so I can't be sure, but that might be kind of related to a delusion of persecution, somebody trying to come after your energy or something like that. The part that's kind of weird to me is it doesn't sound all that different from when people talk about emotional vampires that like talk to you about all these negative things and they actually drain your emotional energy. And I'm like, that doesn't sound all that different from how we talk about things. So there's kind of a thin line between what we would consider normal thinking and this disorganized thinking or this deluded thinking. What we're going to find is that people with schizophrenia are often going to have disturbed perceptions. This is usually going to happen in the form of hallucinations. Now, unlike taking hallucinogens, things like LSD and magic mushrooms, those produce visual hallucinations, but by and large, most of the hallucinations that are experienced in schizophrenia are auditory. So it's all about hearing voices. And oftentimes these voices will tell you a lot of negative things. They'll call you stupid. They'll tell you to hide. Or that you shouldn't go out, or that you shouldn't take your medication. So generally what we're going to find is that these voices have a lot of negative content and they don't really make you feel very good about yourself. Now, here's what's kind of interesting, and I kind of like this theory. How many of you talk to yourself or think to yourself? Do you experience that as a voice in your, as a random voice in your own head, or do you say, that's me thinking? Most of the time, we're going to say that that's me that's thinking. What's kind of interesting with schizophrenia is that schizophrenia is associated with reduced activity in the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are where you basically have a tag that says, this is me. So when you and I think to ourselves, our frontal lobes become active to basically say, this thought comes from me. I said it. Because of that reduced frontal activity, some researchers have actually proposed that the voices that people with schizophrenia are hearing are actually themselves thinking to themselves, but because they don't have the frontal lobe activity, they can't properly tag it as that's me. They're going to tag it as a disembodied voice. And that's a really interesting idea. So they have these hallucinations, and then additionally, they have inappropriate emotions. They're either going to have emotions that are inappropriate for a situation. So if we're at a very serious event, they may start laughing uncontrollably, or they may show no emotion at all, either in their face or in their voice. And this is referred to as flat affect. They may have difficulty initiating tasks, and this is sometimes referred to as avolition. That literally translates to without will. Okay, everybody good? Mariah, do you need some more time? Okay, anybody else need more time? Okay, let me get rid of these annotations. So when we talk about the symptoms of schizophrenia, we tend to talk about them in terms of positive symptoms and negative symptoms. So I want to be really clear. Positive here does not mean good, and negative here does not mean bad. It kind of goes back to our learning and conditioning terminology. Positive means that something is present. Negative means that something is removed or is absent. So in schizophrenia, positive symptoms are when we find inappropriate behaviors are unexpectedly present. So that will include things like hallucinations or delusions. Things have been added to the environment or to the mind that are typically not there in the average person. So that'll include our hallucinations and our delusions. Now compare that to negative symptoms where actions or feelings are unexpectedly absent. So we may experience somebody who has a voice with no tone or no inflection. So somebody who just talks like this all the time, even when they're happy. Oh yes, I'm very, very happy. I had a birthday cake and my party was wonderful. So even when something good is happening, their voice has the same tone. There's no emotional register and their face registers no emotional expression. So again, we're going back to that flat affect. Now, for those who are interested, there are also some cognitive issues. People with schizophrenia tend to have reduced working memory capacity. They also have greater difficulty paying attention to things. So they actually tried this with Anderson Cooper a couple of years ago, or actually maybe about 10 years ago. They put headphones on him that basically had different voices saying things like, "You're stupid," kind of the experience that somebody with schizophrenia might have with voices. And he found that while he was having to listen to those voices, it actually hurt his ability to focus on a task and do it very well. Now, some of those cognitive problems do happen because of that reduced frontal lobe activity as well. Everybody good? All right. So the onset and development, generally what we are going to find is that it's equally likely between men and women, once again, suggesting a very strong genetic link. For most people, it tends to strike in young adulthood. Again, similar to bipolar disorder, we do actually find that with women, there is a second kind of spike around menopause. Again, kind of suggesting that maybe some of this is due to hormonal fluctuation. Now, having said that, though, researchers have looked at children who were later diagnosed with schizophrenia, and they do have some differences in their brain activity and their wiring that is present long before they're ever diagnosed. So do kind of keep that in mind. It can develop gradually, so it's something that kind of happens over time, or it could happen suddenly in what is sometimes referred to as a psychotic break. And generally what we're going to find is for people who have it come on suddenly, that actually makes it a bit more manageable. If it's gradual, recovering from that is a lot harder. So here's what we know. Now, I'm kind of oversimplifying this, but I'm going to be a little technical here because we've got 5 minutes left and I think we're going to be able to finish this. I think so. We do know that in areas like the amygdala, for those of you that may remember, the amygdala is kind of critical for processing emotion. There is an excessive amount of dopamine present in areas of the amygdala. So in the amygdala, dopamine is overactive. In the frontal lobe, dopamine is underactive. So one of the ways that we've actually tried to treat schizophrenia is with what are referred to as atypical antipsychotics, such as Risperdal or Risperidol. That kind of balances the levels of dopamine between the amygdala and the frontal lobe. We do know that in general, people with schizophrenia do have abnormally low brain activity. They also have rapid shrinkage and atrophy in certain parts of the brain. So some of the cells are dying off. The thalamus and the amygdala seems to be really critical with this. We actually find that the thalamus, which is responsible for sensory processing, and the amygdala, which is responsible for emotion, both of these things are highly overactive in people with schizophrenia, and it might contribute to the hallucinations and also the delusions that we see. Genetics is also going to be pretty massive here. We do find that if one identical twin has schizophrenia, odds are pretty good and very highly likely that the other twin will as well. Shared, and it's less common in fraternal twins, and it's not necessarily because of how many genes they share. It's because of the uterine environment. Sharing a placenta seems to be really critical here. We also know that there are some risk factors that do play a role in whether or not one develops schizophrenia. Now, like good sexist people, people originally believed that schizophrenia happened because of unloving mothers called refrigerator mothers who were emotionally cold. We know that that's garbage now. But we do know that in general, if you had a difficult birth, if the umbilical cord was potentially wrapped around your neck, if you had like a breech birth, like my mom almost did with me, where I almost came out butt first instead of head first, you don't want that. If there was low oxygen in your environment, all of those things can affect and increase the likelihood of developing schizophrenia. So the prenatal environment may actually hold a clue. Researchers have suggested and by the way, your birth month matters. Is anybody here born in March or April? Congratulations, you have a slightly higher risk of schizophrenia than anybody else in this room. Why? Because during the second trimester, that tends to coincide with flu season. And so research has actually found that mothers who basically contract a virus like the flu, while they have a developing fetus in the second trimester, we actually get greater likelihood of developing schizophrenia. And we have found that the evidence for this, if the mother has the flu, that leads to a greater risk. We also find that schizophrenia is more often to be diagnosed in children who were born during times of flu epidemics. Areas that are densely populated are more likely to, if you come from a dense population where flu spreads much more easily because other people are around you all the time breathing the same air, you're actually more likely to develop schizophrenia. So somebody coming from a rural population, surprisingly enough, is going to be less likely. Your birth month matters. An early spring birth actually leads to a slightly increased risk. Now, it's going to be reversed in the Southern Hemisphere because our winter is their summer. So do keep that in mind. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, an early fall birth is associated with greater schizophrenia because our summer is their winter. And that's when their flu season is. Yeah.
Is this just the flu, or could we potentially see the same effects like COVID?
I don't know. I think it's a virus that matters because one of the things that we do find mostly they've been checking for the flu, but in general with people who catch viruses, they look at the white blood cell count, and they have found that for kids who are developed schizophrenia, if you look at their mothers, they did tend to have an elevated white blood cell count. That doesn't necessarily mean the flu. It could mean any other type of virus. So there's a lot more we need to learn. But yeah, it could, I mean, it's entirely possible, despite the fact that it's a different type of virus, that COVID could potentially lead to those things as well. All the more reason to take care of yourself. And all right. We're not actually going to test on personality disorders, and we're out of time. So feel free to look at the notes. And if you have any questions on personality disorders, feel free to ask me. I will send you a link to this recording and also a link to my social psychology lectures from last year if you'd like to learn more, but I'm not going to test you on it. And I will be recording our review session for the final exam later this week. Remember, it is online. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you all here on Wednesday.